Theatre Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation.
If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his surcease success. That but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all here, but here upon this bank and shoal of time, we jump the life to come.
This is Theatre Talk. I'm Susan Haskins. There's a wildly successful revival of Macbeth now on Broadway. It's visually stunning, technically innovative, but the most wonderful thing about it is how it brings us new insight into Shakespeare's characters and play. We're so pleased to have with us the star and director of that production, and here to introduce them, my co-host, Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
And we're very happy tonight to be joined by the director of Macbeth, Rupert Goold, who has given us a really mesmerizing production, and the star of the show who is giving us a mesmerizing Macbeth, Patrick Stewart. Welcome to Theatre Talk. Patrick, you've got video projections and blood and gore and all sorts of things going around. We're kind of a long way from the actor who's just there on the bare stage with a couple of planks doing the show. Do you ever feel that you can be sort of overtaken by all the gizmos and projections and the kind of shows they're doing now?
I really am glad that you started with that question. Because, there was a director, one of Rupert's colleagues in a few nights ago, and he said, there's a lot going on, isn't there, in this production? You have a lot to deal with, don't you? And I was surprised that he should say that, because the truth is that it feels as though I am alone, or with Kate or with the rest of the cast. It feels like a bare bones, pared down skeletal production when you're doing it. What you perceive and what Rupert and the creative team have added is so entirely supportive of every detail of character and narrative. You know, it is almost through composed, this show.
What was your initial concept going into it when you started to conceive this production? Can you remember?
Yes, well, I suppose I had two concepts. I always think that Shakespeare is illuminated by a socially specific environment to try and give context to some of the political themes that run through most of his plays, but then also a poetic framework that can access the more Freudian or kind of subconscious or imagistic qualities in the play. And I couldn't quite see how they could be resolved. In The Tempest that Patrick and I had done earlier in the year, similarly we had a sort of a socio-specific world, which was an Arctic environment, which was merging with a sort of Beckettian world. And with this, I was interested in, it's a complicated story of how we got to it, I suppose, but a sort of semi-Soviet world. I was interested in what Scotland meant to England in Jacobean society, that it was a sort of beyond Hadrian's Wall, there was, like beyond the Iron Curtain for the West, a sort of hinterland where strange and tyrannical things were supposed to happen in the British subconscious, I suppose, or the English subconscious, I should say. I was interested in a world where there are daggers in men's smiles, I think is one of the key lines in the play, and that there's a sort of double speak, a use of people not being able to, I think, but dare not speak is a kind of another line that comes through, and it felt very like a kind of Graham Greene world, a Pinter-like world. Actually, they were two kind of central. Yeah,
there's a sense of
styles.
Ministry of Fear
exactly.
about,
of course.
about the production. Interesting. He's an intellectual, this fellow over here. Is this how he directs you? Does he can give you a lecture on Hadrian's Wall when he's helping you prepare for Macbeth?
It's a good thing we have one intellectual around the production. It's because as Rupert says, we did back-to-back productions. I did back-to-back productions. I think you did something in between. And what is so unusual about Rupert in the rehearsal room is that he wears this smartness and creativity so lightly and easily. And one of the dominant recollections of both Tempest and Macbeth is of silence. Because you'll do a scene, big scene maybe, and it finishes, and He doesn't say anything at all. He sits and thinks, and the thinking, once you get used to it, it's fine. You can relax with it.
I'm terrible on compliments. That's the thing. I mean, these guys were doing fantastic work at the coalface.
So this is not, oh, lovey, oh, darling, oh, you were just fabulous, darling.
I don't know what it is. My wife is in the show. Gives
in
me
the show.
absolute hell for it. I mean, my God.
If you don't get a negative note on it, he likes it. You just got to assume that it's okay.
That's a very masculine trait.
Is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
But now I hasten to say that your wife, who's in the show, is Lady Macbeth. Just a magnificent performance. And I'll say, to compliment her, that it wasn't until I read an article about you two in the New York Times that I realized she was your wife, because it never occurred to me that this wonderful actress, that there was any nepotism involved. Not that there was, but that you hadn't gone and gotten the most special Lady Macbeth.
The casting director and I practically had to break his arm off to get Kate into the room to work with us.
Really?
That's how tough.
Why?
it was.
You didn't want her to be in your production?
No, of course. I always knew she was born to play the role, and from the moment that we first talked about doing the show. Of course, in my consciousness was this is the person I think would be brilliant, and particularly, actually, strangely, for the mise en scène that we've come up with, because she has a slightly Slavic look as well, which suits our world. I wanted Patrick to feel comfortable about it, and these plays can be pretty intense to work on, and you want. I valued my family life and being able to go home and, have some pasta and watch the TV.
You don't want to find yourself maybe Lady Macbeth hanging around the rec room with you.
I remember next to on the bedside table there was this really schlocky book saying "Women Who Kill," kind of an anthology of serial killing women in Western court.
I've read that book. It's very good.
If she had a book, Women Who Kill, on her bedside table to prepare for Lady Macbeth, what were you reading to prepare for Macbeth?
Only one. I did go to Foyles one afternoon before we began rehearsals. Rupert and I had already had some conversations, and I had a feeling of where he was going with the concept of the production. He'd given me this image, which was so potent for me, of all of those old men wearing big hats standing on Lenin's tomb on the May Day parade, and that really sparked for me. But I went to Foyles and I bought everything on Stalin that I could find. It was a pile this big. But in them was one little slim paperback by Martin Amis called Cobra the Dread. And I didn't even know Amis, who is a hero of mine. I'm just crazy about his writing and work. And I didn't know he'd written this thing. And it ended up being the only bit of research that I did, because everything that I needed was so vividly in that book.
What does he say about Stalin
Well,
specifically?
he gave a very intimate portrait of Stalin the man, Stalin, his relationship with his cabinet, with his generals, with his children, with his family, with the people who worked for him, assistant secretaries and so forth. But it also gives an overall picture of the impact of this man on Soviet society. And I was really so naive and innocent. I had no comprehension of the extent of the human damage that this one man had committed on Soviet-associated society. I mean, the figure 20 million dead with the collectivization and the purges.
Well, this does really work in what Macbeth is about and what your production is, because you see, as soon as this couple seizes power, it's not just their household that falls apart. It is the entire country.
Actually, the Stalin thing was very much. Patrick was really the author of a lot of that. I mean, I'd sort of given this sort of Soviet mise en scène. In fact, actually, I think the first picture I brought in was actually there was a picture of Khrushchev lighting a soldier's cigar in the woods with a gun lighter. And it was this very menacing, it's kind of jovial kind of vulgar expression, but this really menacing image. And actually, it was through that, and then actually it tied slightly with some of Patrick's thoughts as well about playing him, like, I think the word here is rube, that he was a sort of a hick kind of a bit of a backwoodsman thing, and had been made by, ambitious, possibly second kind of new wife. And Stalin, of course, was a Georgian.
He was a Georgian.
Yeah,
he was a peasant.
Yeah, exactly.
Georgian.
And that fed into lots of, particularly the second half of our production, or the middle of our production, I should say. I mean, I've always felt that one of the things that's been a great challenge about, I mean, there are lots of challenges about the play, the witches and all these different things that you have to surmount, but one of them is that the action builds famously to the big death, the death of the king, the night of the murder, very powerfully, very tautly. And then a lot of productions I'd seen had kind of lost energy after that because they just pushed to that, and then what happens to the rest of the play?
Yes.
Well, we know he's going to die eventually,
Yes.
we think. But actually, I think all that starness world that Patrick was sort of bringing out and researching really, you know, just lifted the middle part of the play.
There were so many times I found myself sitting in your production saying, I wasn't really aware of that line. I wasn't really aware of that interplay between characters. I was just hearing things and understanding relationships I hadn't before.
Away, and mock the time with fairest show. False face must hide what the false heart doth know.
And you weren't modernizing it, but you were just contextualizing it so strongly.
Yeah, we tried to give a lot of sort of real things to be happening in the
Yes.
scenes, you know, being on trains or making sandwiches or
Like
kind
Flay on Seeding Cake was
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I love
Well,
it.
you know, I mean, the genius of that,
Yes,
the
that was
best
genius.
director for, you know, I learned, or anything I've learned on that is Trevor Nunn, actually. I mean,
Really?
he's really, really a wonderful director at doing those things. And in fact, my wife Kate was in a production of Love Labour's Lost. I remember at the Olivier, and it was at the National, and it was so wonderful. I remember watching a twitching fish at one point. A fisherman had just caught and thinking, there's something wrong with this production. I'm watching the fish, not the actor.
Well, I
sometimes worry about that.
is there ever a danger though? Because you have the wonderful scene where you're making a sandwich for the assassins. And how do you sort of work that? Just technically work that out, that bit of business?
It's now become so part of the scene that when we were working on it to open at Brooklyn, at BAM, we didn't have the props. And I was having to mind the props, and the scene completely fell apart because I could not do the dialogue. The dialogue just simply disappeared because I didn't have the sandwich to make. It's become so connected together, all of that. But something happened last night, actually, and it was delightful. But I only tell this because it's an indication, I think, of the sort of thinking that lies behind the production. At some point towards the end of that scene, I very delicately lift up my sweater and I pull out a white handkerchief from my pocket and I wipe my fingers and I dab my mouth. Well, last night I very delicately did this and there was no handkerchief in the pocket. For the first time in 184 performances, no handkerchief. But I had these smeary hands. So I walked over to Nottie and I wiped my hands on his coat. And it brought the house down.
Really?
Because, I literally stopped the show. The audience laughed so much. It was a laugh that came totally out of character and situation. And I know that audience went away thinking, what a great piece of business. But in fact, it was a...
You better get back to this production. You see, when the director's away, these actors begin enhancing things like that. But there are moments, though, in the play, the set speeches, the famous speeches. Do you feel when you come to those moments, then you have to just deliver those speeches that way to sort of clear away all the other stuff going on?
Well, you've got to have a... First and foremost, you've got to have a brilliant actor doing them and speaking them, you know, and Patrick's, you know, obviously his emotional connection and his gravitas is always going to connect, but his technique is, I mean, the sandwich in a different way, the sandwich and verse speaking, they're both technical skills, you know, let's not make any bones about it, they're the difficult things to do live in front of 1,000 people. I think we were also helped in, we made a bold choice, and this seems a really small thing, but in the lighting, in that, you know, I said to the lighting designer, you always can never see anything in these plays. You always see productions of Macbeth and you can see nothing. They're so gloomy. And I said, let's do it bright but hard. And I think that helps some of these speeches actually sometimes because we get, you know, great actors being very still. You know, I think a lot of I was met an agent the other day who said that, you know, one of the things that screen actors often struggle with on stage, ironically, is stillness. You know, the bravery, particularly with some of this big language, is to be still. And I think that's, you know, Patrick has it innately, but some of the other actors as well, you know, their classical experience or maybe experience of doing the show and learning from
when you come to the set speeches tomorrow, is there a sort of the danger that you're going to do them with the quotations for the audience, that this is the big moment, you have to listen to it? How do you, in other words, I'm asking you, how do you approach some of the most famous speeches in the English language?
I've always tried to find some way of taking the audience a little bit by surprise, and I've been doing this ever since I played Ina Barbas years and years and years ago, and I would find myself saying, the bard she sat in like a burning, and find that the audience would be quietly singing along with you, because it's one of those pieces that everybody knows. This play is littered with them. So I think we both of us have tried to find natural, spontaneous, impetuous ways of beginning these great speeches, and Rupert is an absolute tyrant about keeping them intellectually sound and reasoned and argued and thought through, whereas my instinct would often be to emotionalize them a little bit. And the constant note from Rupert whenever he's returned has been, you've got to pull back the emotion in and go back to the argument and the reasoning. And I think if you truly think through each word in the moment, then the audience are tricked into thinking that they've never heard it before. Because what the actor has to do is to convince himself he has never said it before.
Yeah, but I think that's right. That is the trick. I mean, when you come to those speeches, the audience has to feel, wow, I'm hearing this for the first time.
And
now in the context of the whole play, not just, taken out.
Tomorrow was
Well, I have to be honest about that. I ran into Sir Ian McKellen on the street just before we started rehearsals. He was actually doing his first run-through of King Lear, and he'd disappeared. They'd lost him, and he'd gone to buy some sticky buns down the road and was wandering up the road eating them. And I said to him, hey, they're missing you. And he said, I'm in the middle of the storm. I said, okay. But anyway, we got talking, and he said, can I just give you just one little tip, because he is a famous
Macbeth, yeah.
And anything at all. This was some weeks before we began. He said, tomorrow, the important word is and. And it was like, a flash of comprehension. And I said, I get it, don't say it anymore. So Ian is entirely to be thanked for...
And Ian's right? Do you agree? The important word in that speech is and?
Absolutely, but I can't. Patrick owns it in his own way. I don't think. I mean, it's a funny thing though. I mean, the one I think is most sensitive, because I think I remember talking about this at some point, was when Patrick says, if he says, "Is this a dagger I see?" But you can feel the audience go, "Oh, it's the dagger speech." Yeah, right. But if he says, "Is this a dagger?" They're aware of it. But if he says, "Is this a dagger I see before me?" then they're cheated of something. And I think it is. These are arias.
Is this a dagger which I see before me? The handle toward my hand. Come, let me clutch thee.
And often they may know the first line but know nothing of the rest of it. Everyone knows to be or not to be, but they may not know the rest of the great speech. And those first lines, and Shakespeare's a genius for this, is he sets the whole thing up in the first line of those great soliloquies, and then you just take them through it. And of course, you don't want to rush them. It would be wrong to rush them. They've got to be inhabited. But I always think they're like seeing someone on a high wire.
Yeah.
You say, they've stepped off. Yeah. And the thrill is how high the wire is and how far they'll get across it.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Is that how you feel?
Well, it wasn't until this moment.
Well, we better go see the show tonight and see what happens when you come to the dagger speech.
I found myself asking in this production, would Macbeth have become this killer without being with Lady Macbeth?
I think there is a codependency in this relationship. I think she provides him with missing elements that make him ambitious and make him murderous, but the fundamental elements are there inside him. Somebody asked the question, I don't know whether you know who Myra Hindley, Ian Brady were, but they were a couple who murdered horribly a lot of children.
Right, yes.
In England.
The Moors, right?
The Moors murders, absolutely. People have asked, would Ian Brady have existed without Myra Hindley? And by the way, I have a quote from Myra Hindley, which has gone from theatre to theatre with me. It's stuck on my dressing room mirror.
What is it?
Myra Hindley in an interview said, evil can be a spiritual thing too. And it's the two which gives the sting to that extraordinary sense. I could not conceive of undertaking any of the major things in this play without Kate's Lady Macbeth. This very, very specific Lady Macbeth.
Interesting. What happens, we can see with Macbeth, you can see him, Lady Macbeth having to push him to do these things. So you see him before he becomes, a villain, if you will. You can see the more human side of him. But with her, she comes on so strong, and then she cracks. What do you think it is that makes her crack?
Rejection. I mean, it's rejection
from him.
Macbeth, yeah. And it's Shakespeare is very terse, and you have to really connect. It happens in one line practically. Or in fact, it probably actually happens in a scene you don't see, or not a scene, off stage, as it were. But he kills. Mm-hmm. Well, that's different. He murders. Of course, he's been a killer before. He's a soldier, right. But he murders, and it makes it a sort of totally solipsistic, single-minded thing for him after that point, and he ceases to need her, or moves on a journey of ceasing to need her. I'm interpreting for Patrick here, but where she can't live without him, and so she breaks. Then I think, and I think. So
it's not her guilt. There's not guilt. That's
no,
not
the interesting thing, Lady Macbeth never says, "I wish I hadn't done it."
Yeah.
She says, what did she say? All's had. Naught spent where our desire is got without content. She says it's not going very well.
Right.
I wish he was happier, but she never says we shouldn't have done it.
And even
in the sleepwalking, she says, "Who'd have thought he had?"
Is she afraid of being caught?
I think he voices lots of fears about what will happen to him after, as a consequence of the murder. What will happen to him in the afterlife? What will happen to him in the public gaze? I feel at the final moment, I think he refines his heroism, because Macduff says, "You'll be a coward, and we'll all laugh at you for giving up." And he's very concerned with how his actions will lead to consequences. I think she doesn't have that scruple.
And Patrick, is that why he's a hero? That he never gives up? I mean, that at the end he's saying, "Lay on."
I find it very hard to think of him as a hero.
You do, all right. And you don't put that across, which is interesting.
Which is really important, I think.
Yeah, interesting.
He's a complicated man, but he's a bad, complicated man.
And why? And in your mind, why is he rejecting Lady Macbeth? Because the way you guys play it, there is this wonderful sexual dynamic between the two of you, which I always think has got to be key. And you've got to feel that Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, up until it switches, are having fantastic sex all the time.
But importantly, unproductive sex.
Yeah.
I think and that there is.
They have no issue except a murder.
Yes, that's right.
And there's something.
No son of mine succeeding, he says. And it's an ambiguous kind of line. Was there a son? Did he want to have a son? Might there still be a son? Why isn't there a son? It just isn't there. But I think that something happens to him after the murder, and after the fact that he is seen, that the critical scene is immediately after Duncan's death, when he finds that he can bluff. He can pull it off, whereas she is already beginning to unravel somewhat after the murder. And he, I think, gets on such a high from his own personal success in all of that, that little by little, she becomes unnecessary to the good feeling that he has. He can have that good feeling without her.
Fascinating.
Wow.
We just have a minute left. I would like to ask you both about Paul Scofield, great British actor who died a few weeks ago. Did you know him? Did you see some of those famous performances? And what made him so great? And what was he like as a person, if you knew him?
I saw the performances. I didn't know him. I once did a season at Stratford, ironically, when he was playing Macbeth, with Vivian Merchant, Harold Pinter's first wife, as Lady Macbeth. It was, I think, generally believed to be perhaps one of the most unsuccessful productions that Peter Hall had ever done. It failed as a production, like many productions of Macbeth do fail. I was in awe of him, never spoke two words to him. I was far too intimidated. I saw his Lear on stage.
And was it as great as they...
Stupendous. Really? And completely original. I mean, he played him without any kind of sentiment at all. He was brutal, monstrous man.
Did he play like sort of the short beard and fierce coming in there?
He was kind of unshaven and a short-cropped, wiry hair, and he was angry a lot of the time and violent. He was a really unpleasant person. And you had enormous sympathy with the daughters, because they were constantly abused by him. And it was a fascinating interpretation of it. He was an absolute original as an actor. Yeah. The voice, the movement, the attitude, the interpretations, it bore no relationship to anybody else of his generation at all.
Fascinating.
Great
I
man.
assume there's a Lear in your future.
One day, hopefully.
With you directing?
Oh, I'd love to. We've got a few others before then, I think. Still young.
What would you like to tackle? Is there anything you'd like to, not Shakespeare, any plays that you'd like to see him in that you'd like to direct?
I mean, well, Patrick's got a background in Ibsen, and
Yeah.
clearly he'd be great in a lot of that. This man sings as well. He should be in a musical. That's the real.
You're doing Oliver.
I know. Well, he'd be perfect. He's not free.
There's a
I'm not
Fagin.
infuriated. He'd be brilliant, but he's
Well,
not
maybe
free.
when you bring it to Broadway.
Listen, we want to thank you both
you.
for taking the time to meet with us today. Patrick Stewart in Macbeth, brilliantly directed by Rupert Goold. Thanks for being our guests tonight on Theatre Talk. Appreciate it.
If we should fail.
Fail! But screw your courage to the sticking place. And we'll not fail